The moment my wife dumped a bucket of dirty water over my head, everyone in the room laughed, and not one of them realized they were laughing at the man who owned the company that paid their salaries. The water hit my shoulders first, cold and gritty, soaking through my dress shirt and running down the front of my jacket. A few drops splashed onto the polished ballroom floor, catching the light from the crystal chandeliers above. For a second, nobody moved. Then the laughter started. It rolled across the room like a wave. Some people covered their mouths. Others didn't even try. They laughed openly, comfortably, like they had been waiting for this moment all night. My wife, Melissa, stood a few feet away holding the empty plastic bucket. A smile spread across her face. Not an embarrassed smile. Not the kind that says a joke got out of hand. No, this was satisfaction. The kind of smile that comes from believing you finally put someone in their place. Maybe now you'll stop embarrassing me, she said loudly. More laughter followed. I stood there without saying a word. Dirty water dripped from my sleeves and gathered near my shoes. The band had stopped playing. The waiters froze. Even the people at nearby tables turned their chairs to get a better look. Nobody wanted to miss the show. The annual Walker Family Appreciation Gala was one of the biggest events the company hosted each year. Hundreds of employees attended. Managers brought their spouses. Executives shook hands with investors. The ballroom at the Hilton outside Dallas was packed wall to wall, with people wearing tailored suits and expensive dresses. Everyone looked successful. Everyone looked important. And according to my wife's family, I was the one person in the room who didn't belong. Melissa crossed her arms. Look at him, she said. 42 years old and still acting like he matters. Her younger brother Brandon nearly choked laughing. Come on, sis. Be fair. Ethan's contribution is making sure your car gets washed. The table exploded again. Their father, Richard Walker, leaned back in his chair with the smug confidence of a man who believed the world finally made sense. Richard had spent years climbing through the company ranks. He loved titles, office politics, and reminding people how important he was. Tonight, he looked especially pleased. At least the boy knows how to stand there quietly, he said. That's the first professional thing he's done in years. More laughter, more smiles, more people nodding along. I looked around the room slowly. Faces everywhere. Men and women who believed they understood exactly who I was. To them, I was Melissa's husband. The unemployed husband. The quiet husband. The husband who supposedly spent his days doing nothing while his wife built a successful career. It was a story Melissa had been telling for years. A story her family happily repeated. Eventually, people stopped questioning it. That's how lies work. Repeat them long enough, and they become introductions. The funny thing was, I never bothered correcting anyone. Not because I couldn't. Because I didn't care. At least, I used to think I didn't care. But standing there with dirty water dripping from my clothes while my wife turned me into entertainment for hundreds of people, I felt something shift. Not anger. Not humiliation. Something colder. Something clearer. The room smelled like expensive perfume, steak dinners, and fresh flowers. The chandeliers sparkled overhead. A photographer near the stage lowered his camera awkwardly, unsure whether he should keep documenting the moment. Melissa noticed him and laughed. Oh, don't stop now, she called. This is probably the most attention Ethan's gotten in years. The crowd loved that one. I glanced toward the stage, toward the giant company logo hanging behind the podium, toward the name every employee in that ballroom proudly worked under. Walker Global Industries. Most people assumed the name came from Richard Walker. They assumed the company belonged to his side of the family. They assumed Melissa's promotions were the result of family influence and hard work. They assumed a lot of things. What they didn't know was that almost every assumption in that room was wrong. And as another drop of dirty water slid from my sleeve and landed on the marble floor, I realized something important. In less than an hour, every person laughing would wish they had stayed silent. The laughter kept going for a few more seconds, then slowly faded into the background noise of clinking glasses and whispered conversations. People always lose interest faster than they gain it. A public embarrassment is exciting for a moment. After that, they move on to dessert. I reached for a linen napkin from a nearby table and calmly wiped a few drops of dirty water from my hands. Melissa watched me carefully. She wanted a reaction. That was the entire point. She wanted anger. She wanted an argument. She wanted proof that I was exactly the man she had spent years describing to everyone around her. Instead, I folded the napkin once and placed it neatly beside an untouched glass of water. Her smile faltered for the first time that evening. It was small, barely noticeable, but I saw it. 15 years earlier, Melissa had smiled very differently. Back then, she was a junior marketing assistant earning less than $50,000 a year. We lived in a small apartment outside Fort Worth. The carpet was worn. The refrigerator rattled every night. During the summer, the air conditioning struggled to keep up with the Texas heat. We were not wealthy. We were not connected. We were simply two people trying to build a life together. I remember sitting on the balcony with her after work, sharing takeout containers and talking about the future. She used to laugh at my terrible jokes. She used to reach for my hand without thinking. When she talked about success, it was never about titles or money. It was about freedom, time, family, peace. Somewhere along the way, those dreams changed. The first promotion changed a little. The second promotion changed more. Then came executive dinners, networking events, private golf invitations, and people who measured human value by job titles printed on business cards. Melissa adapted quickly, faster than anyone expected. She learned the language. She learned the politics. She learned how to impress the right people. Eventually, she learned something else. She learned how much social status could influence respect. The higher she climbed, the more she seemed embarrassed by anything that did not fit the image she wanted to project. At first, the comments were subtle. She would joke about how quiet I was. Then she started introducing me differently. Then she stopped introducing me at all. Her family followed her lead. Richard loved success because it made him feel important. Susan loved success because it gave her something to talk about with friends. Brandon loved success because he believed proximity to powerful people made him powerful too. Every year their opinions grew louder. Every year my silence became proof of whatever story they wanted to tell. The truth never interested them. The truth was inconvenient. I glanced around the ballroom again. Nearly every employee present worked somewhere inside the company structure. Department managers, regional directors, analysts, account executives, human resources teams, operations supervisors. Most of them had spent years building careers they were proud of. Some had even spent decades there. They believed they understood the company. They believed they understood where authority began and ended. They had no reason to think otherwise. Very few people ever looked beyond the public organizational chart. Very few people knew what existed behind layers of trusts, holding groups, and private ownership agreements. That knowledge belonged to attorneys, accountants, and a handful of board members. Melissa certainly did not know. Her father did not know either. Neither did Brandon. And that ignorance had become the foundation of their confidence. Across the ballroom, a large screen displayed a slideshow celebrating company milestones. New facilities, expansion projects, record profits, employee recognition awards. Applause followed each image. Richard pointed toward the screen and proudly explained something to a nearby executive. He looked completely comfortable, completely secure, a man convinced he understood his place in the world. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. A server approached and quietly offered me a fresh towel. I thanked her and accepted it. She nodded politely before moving on. Small gestures reveal more character than speeches ever do. While executives laughed at me, an employee earning an hourly wage was the only person in the room who showed basic kindness. Funny how often that happens. I finished drying my hands and looked toward the ballroom entrance. That was when I noticed a familiar black sedan pulling up outside the glass lobby doors. The timing was interesting. Very interesting. Because the person stepping out of that car was not scheduled to arrive for another 45 minutes. And judging by the expression on his face as he entered the building, something had already changed. The man who stepped through the ballroom entrance was Daniel Brooks, the chief executive officer of Walker Global Industries. Most people noticed him immediately. Daniel had that effect on rooms. Conversations softened when he appeared. Managers straightened their posture. Executives suddenly became interested in looking professional. He was the public face of the company, the man featured in interviews, annual reports, and industry conferences. To most employees, Daniel Brooks was the highest authority they would ever encounter. Richard Walker spotted him first and immediately adjusted his suit jacket. The confidence on his face returned. If anything, Daniel's arrival made him feel even more important. Richard pushed away from his table and began moving toward the entrance with the eager smile of a man hoping to be seen. Melissa noticed him too. She brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear and subtly checked her reflection in a nearby window. It was almost automatic. Appearances mattered to her now. They mattered more than honesty, more than loyalty, and certainly more than the man she had married 15 years earlier. I watched quietly as Daniel entered the ballroom. Something felt different. His pace was faster than usual. His expression was serious, focused, not the relaxed confidence people expected from him during corporate events. He greeted a few employees with quick nods, but did not stop to talk. That alone was unusual. Richard finally reached him near the entrance. Even from across the room, I could see Richard launching into conversation immediately. His hands moved animatedly. His smile widened. He pointed toward the ballroom, probably discussing attendance numbers or company growth or some other subject he believed would impress the chief executive officer. Daniel listened for a moment. Then something happened. His eyes moved past Richard, past the crowd, past the executives. They landed directly on me. The distance between us was nearly 100 feet. Yet the moment was unmistakable. Daniel saw me standing there beside the table, my clothes still damp, and his entire expression changed. Richard kept talking. Daniel was no longer listening. Melissa noticed the shift too. I could tell because she turned toward Daniel and followed his line of sight. When she realized he was looking at me, confusion briefly crossed her face. The feeling disappeared almost immediately. She dismissed it. People often ignore things that do not fit the story they already believe. Daniel said something short to Richard. Whatever it was caused Richard to stop speaking. Then Daniel began walking. Not toward the executive tables. Not toward the stage. Toward me. One step. Then another. Conversations started fading again. Humans notice movement. Especially unusual movement. More and more heads turned to watch the chief executive officer crossing the ballroom floor. Brandon noticed first. "What is he doing?" he asked. Susan frowned. "Maybe he is greeting employees." Brandon laughed. "Then why is he coming here?" "Good question." The answer sat quietly inside every ownership agreement, board resolution, and trust document connected to Walker Global Industries. The answer had existed for decades. Most people simply never knew where to look. Daniel continued walking. Richard hurried behind him now, clearly confused. A pair of vice presidents followed as well. Then another executive joined them. It looked less like a greeting and more like a procession. Melissa shifted uncomfortably beside the table. "This is strange," she muttered. I said nothing. The marble floor reflected the ballroom lights beneath Daniel's polished shoes. The crowd gradually opened a path for him. Hundreds of people watched. Some whispered. Some looked curious. Others simply looked lost. A few moments earlier they had been laughing at me. Now they were trying to understand why the most powerful executive in the company seemed focused on one person. Daniel stopped several feet away. The room had become remarkably quiet. Even the band remained silent. For a second, neither of us spoke. His eyes moved briefly to the water stains on my jacket, then back to my face. The look that crossed his expression was not amusement. It was concern. Genuine concern. Melissa saw it. Richard saw it. Everyone close enough saw it. And for the first time that evening, uncertainty began spreading through the Walker family. It was subtle, barely visible, but it was there. The foundation beneath their confidence had started to crack. Daniel straightened slightly. Behind him, executives stood waiting. Richard looked completely bewildered. Melissa looked pale. Brandon stopped smiling altogether. The ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Then Daniel opened his mouth and spoke 5 simple words that instantly changed the atmosphere in the room. "Mr. Carter, are you all right?" For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence felt heavier than all the laughter that had filled the ballroom minutes earlier. Daniel Brooks stood in front of me waiting for an answer while several senior executives watched from behind him. Richard Walker looked as if someone had suddenly started speaking a language he did not understand. Melissa blinked twice, her expression frozen somewhere between confusion and disbelief. I glanced down at the damp sleeve of my jacket before looking back at Daniel. "I am fine, Daniel," I said calmly. "Thank you for asking." Relief crossed his face immediately. Not dramatic relief. Professional relief. The kind a person shows when they have confirmed that an important problem is not as serious as it first appeared. The reaction did not go unnoticed. People were watching every detail now. Every look. Every word. Every shift in body language. Richard stepped forward. "Daniel," he said with an awkward laugh. "I think there has been some misunderstanding here." Daniel finally turned toward him. Has there, he asked. Richard forced another smile. Just a family joke. Nothing serious. Family joke. Interesting phrase. A few minutes earlier, he had enjoyed every second of it. Now he wanted to minimize it. Daniel looked around the ballroom. His eyes briefly moved across the wet floor, the empty bucket near Melissa's table, and the stains still visible on my clothing. Then he returned his attention to Richard. I see. His voice remained polite, controlled, professional, yet something underneath had changed. Even people who did not know Daniel well could hear it. Melissa stepped forward next. This is being blown out of proportion, she said. It was harmless. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me again, almost as if my opinion mattered more than anyone else's in the room. That made several people visibly uncomfortable. Melissa noticed it too. Her shoulders stiffened. For years, she had carefully built an image of me as someone insignificant, someone irrelevant, someone whose opinions carried no weight. Watching the chief executive officer treat me differently was creating a problem she could not immediately solve. Daniel lowered his voice slightly. Would you mind if we spoke privately for a moment? He asked. Several heads turned instantly. A private conversation. With me. The request landed in the room like a dropped glass. Nobody missed its significance. Before I could answer, Richard interrupted. Actually, Daniel, I was hoping to discuss next quarter's regional expansion strategy with you. Daniel never even looked at him. That can wait. Richard's face tightened. Not enough for most people to notice. Enough for me. Melissa folded her arms. Brandon stared openly now. Susan looked worried. The certainty that had defined their evening was beginning to disappear. Daniel waited patiently. I considered the request for a second before shaking my head. No need, I said. Anything important can be discussed here. A strange expression crossed Daniel's face. Respect. That was the closest word for it. He nodded once. Understood. Behind him, one of the vice presidents shifted uncomfortably. Another executive whispered something to a colleague. The tension in the ballroom continued growing. People sensed that something larger was unfolding. They simply could not identify what it was. The giant screen behind the stage continued displaying company achievements. New offices, record earnings, expansion into additional markets. Years ago, I had approved many of those initiatives personally, not from a corner office, not from a public position, from somewhere much quieter, much less visible. Most people assume power announces itself. In reality, real power often stays hidden. Hidden power avoids attention. Hidden power avoids headlines. Hidden power lets other people take credit. That approach had served me well for nearly 2 decades. Unfortunately, it had also allowed people like Melissa and her family to invent their own version of reality. Daniel glanced toward the stage where several board members had started arriving. That caught my attention. Their appearance was unexpected. The timing was wrong. They were not scheduled until later in the evening. One board member, then another, then a third. Each entered through a side corridor and quietly took notice of the situation developing near the center of the ballroom. Daniel noticed them too. His expression darkened slightly. Not with anger, with concern. That was when I realized something important. Whatever had brought him here early tonight was probably connected to why the board members had arrived early as well. Something had happened before the gala even started. Something significant. Melissa stepped closer to me. Her voice dropped low enough that only I could hear it. What is going on? She asked. For the first time all evening, there was uncertainty in her voice. Genuine uncertainty. I looked at her for a few seconds before answering. I think, I said quietly, you are about to find out how little you actually know about the company you work for. Her face lost color immediately. Across the ballroom, another set of doors opened. More executives entered. More board members followed. And suddenly, every instinct I had told me the evening was about to become much bigger than a family embarrassment. The atmosphere inside the ballroom had completely changed. 10 minutes earlier, people had been enjoying dinner, trading business cards, and laughing at what they thought was harmless entertainment. Now nobody seemed interested in the food. Forks sat untouched. Conversations died halfway through sentences. Every eye followed the growing group of executives and board members gathering near the center of the room. Melissa remained beside me, but I could feel the distance growing between us. Not physical distance. Something else. The distance that appears when certainty begins to disappear. She looked toward Daniel, then toward the arriving board members, then back at me. Each glance seemed to raise new questions she did not want to ask out loud. Richard tried to regain control of the situation. That was his instinct. Control the narrative. Control the room. Control the perception. He cleared his throat and forced a confident smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced loudly, "it appears we have some unexpected guests joining us early tonight." A few nervous chuckles followed. Nobody seemed sure whether they should laugh. Daniel did not smile. Neither did the board members. Richard's confidence weakened slightly. One of the board members, a silver-haired woman named Margaret Ellis, walked directly toward Daniel. She had served on the board for over 20 years and rarely attended public company events unless something important required her presence. She stopped beside him and lowered her voice. They exchanged a few quiet words. I noticed Daniel nod once, then twice. Whatever they were discussing, it was serious. Very serious. Around the ballroom, senior managers began noticing the same thing. Executives who normally carried themselves with complete confidence suddenly looked uneasy. They recognized board-level behavior when they saw it. This was not social conversation. This was business. High-level business. Melissa folded her arms tighter. "Why are board members here?" she whispered. I looked toward the stage. That is a good question. Her eyes narrowed. She hated that answer. Melissa had always preferred certainty. She liked knowing where people stood, who held power, who answered to whom, what she could gain from every relationship. Ambiguity made her uncomfortable. Unfortunately for her, ambiguity was all she had now. Near the stage, another board member checked his watch and exchanged a look with Margaret Ellis. The gesture lasted less than a second, but it told me enough. They were waiting for something. Or someone. Richard apparently reached the same conclusion. He approached Daniel again. "Is there an issue we should know about?" he asked carefully. Daniel remained professional. "There will be a brief announcement later this evening." Richard forced another smile. "Regarding what?" Daniel paused. "Corporate governance." The answer hit harder than most people realized. Corporate governance discussions did not happen at celebration galas. Corporate governance discussions happened when ownership structures changed, when leadership changed, or when major decisions affected the future of the company. Several executives immediately exchanged concerned looks. Richard noticed it too. The color slowly drained from his face. Melissa looked at her father, then at Daniel, then at me. Her confusion was becoming visible now. The ballroom lights reflected against the polished company logo hanging above the stage. Walker Global Industries. The name looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. Yet somehow everything around it felt different. Strange how quickly certainty can evaporate. One moment people believe they understand the world. The next moment they realize they have only been looking at part of the picture. A server quietly replaced the glass of water near my seat. I thanked him. He nodded politely and moved on. Small details continued standing out to me. Perhaps because everyone else was focused on the wrong things. They were watching titles, watching executives, watching appearances. They were not paying attention to the patterns. The board members had arrived early. Daniel had arrived early. Certain legal advisors were now entering through the side doors as well. That detail interested me most. Lawyers rarely attended company celebrations unless paperwork was involved. Significant paperwork. Melissa followed my gaze and noticed them too. "Why are attorneys here?" she asked. This time there was no confidence left in her voice. I took a slow sip of water before answering. Because major decisions usually require signatures. Her eyes widened slightly. Across the room, Daniel checked his phone. A message appeared on the screen. He read it once and immediately looked toward the ballroom entrance. Margaret Ellis followed his gaze. Then another board member did the same. One by one, senior leaders throughout the room turned toward the doors. Whatever they had been waiting for had finally arrived. The massive ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Hundreds of employees sat frozen in anticipation. Melissa looked toward the entrance. Richard looked toward the entrance. Brandon stopped pretending everything was normal and looked toward the entrance too. Then the doors slowly opened, and the first person to step inside was carrying a leather portfolio containing documents that would change the entire evening. The man carrying the leather portfolio moved through the ballroom with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly why he was there. He was not an executive. He was not a manager. He was one of the company's senior corporate attorneys, Thomas Reynolds. I had worked with him for years. Most people in the room had never spoken to him. Many probably did not even know his name. Yet the moment Daniel Brooks saw him, he walked forward immediately. Margaret Ellis followed. Then the other board members joined them. The group formed a quiet circle near the stage. Nobody smiled. Nobody looked relaxed. Melissa stared at them. "What is happening?" she whispered again. I did not answer. Sometimes people learn more when silence forces them to keep watching. Thomas opened the portfolio and removed several folders. Thick folders. Official folders. The kind that carried consequences. The kind that changed careers. Across the ballroom, dozens of employees had stopped pretending to enjoy the evening. Their attention remained fixed on the stage area. Rumors were already spreading. I could see it happening table by table. One person whispered. Another leaned closer. Then 3 more joined the conversation. Human beings hate uncertainty. They fill empty spaces with speculation. Richard Walker looked increasingly uncomfortable. For the first time in years, he was not the center of attention. Worse, he had no idea what was happening. His authority depended on information. Tonight, he had none. Brandon tried to laugh it off. "Probably another boring board announcement," he said. Nobody agreed with him. Not even Susan. The confidence had disappeared from their table. The board members reviewed documents one by one. Daniel signed something. Margaret signed something else. Thomas organized the paperwork carefully before handing additional pages to another attorney who had entered moments earlier. Everything looked methodical, planned, important. Then Daniel checked his watch and nodded toward the stage coordinator. The coordinator immediately hurried toward the audio booth. That small movement changed everything. A microphone announcement meant the private discussions were over. Whatever decision had been made was about to become public. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly. Conversation stopped almost instantly. Hundreds of people turned toward the stage. Daniel climbed the steps first. Margaret Ellis followed. The rest of the board members took their places nearby. Richard stood frozen beside his table. Melissa looked from the stage to me and back again. I could almost see the questions racing through her mind. Questions she should have asked years ago. Daniel adjusted the microphone. The room became silent. "Good evening, everyone," he began. His voice echoed through the ballroom speakers. "Thank you for joining us tonight." A few polite nods appeared throughout the audience. Daniel continued. "I realize this announcement was not originally scheduled for this portion of the evening. However, circumstances require that we address several important matters immediately." The phrase "important matters" landed heavily. Executives exchanged nervous looks. Managers sat straighter in their chairs. Daniel glanced toward the board members, then toward Thomas Reynolds, then back to the audience. Walker Global Industries has experienced extraordinary growth over the last 2 decades. That growth was possible because of strong leadership, dedicated employees, and a long-term ownership structure designed to protect the company for future generations. Ownership structure. The moment those words left his mouth, I noticed Margaret Ellis briefly looking in my direction. Only for a second, yet several people caught it. Melissa caught it too. Her eyes narrowed immediately. Daniel continued speaking. "Most employees are familiar with the operational side of our organization. Fewer people are familiar with the governance structure behind it." A ripple moved through the room. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Daniel was moving toward territory that very few people ever discussed publicly. Thomas Reynolds stepped forward and handed him a document. Daniel reviewed it briefly before speaking again. "Tonight, the board has finalized several governance actions that will take effect immediately." The room grew even quieter. Melissa looked pale now. Brandon stopped fidgeting. Susan gripped the edge of the table. Richard stared at the stage as though willing reality to change. Daniel folded the document and placed it on the podium. Then he looked directly toward my side of the ballroom. Not at the executives. Not at Richard. Not at Melissa. At me. Hundreds of people followed his gaze. One by one, heads turned in my direction. The shift spread across the room like a wave. Confusion became curiosity. Curiosity became suspicion. And suspicion slowly became realization that something far larger than a routine corporate announcement was unfolding. Daniel took a breath. "Before we proceed," he said calmly, "there is one individual whose presence tonight is particularly important." The entire ballroom turned toward me. Every conversation stopped. Every expression froze. And for the first time all evening, Melissa looked at me not with embarrassment, not with frustration, but with genuine fear. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The silence felt almost unreal. Hundreds of employees sat frozen in their seats, staring at me, while Daniel Brooks remained behind the podium. I could hear the faint hum of the ballroom air conditioning. The soft clink of a glass somewhere near the back. Small sounds suddenly seemed louder when an entire room stopped breathing. Melissa stood beside the table, with her eyes locked on me. Richard looked as though he was trying to solve a puzzle missing half its pieces. Brandon stared openly, his earlier confidence completely gone. Daniel waited until the room settled before continuing. Many of you know the history of Walker Global Industries, he said. You know where we are today? You know the public milestones, the acquisitions, the growth, the expansion into new markets. Several employees nodded automatically. They had heard versions of this speech before. Annual reports, corporate meetings, leadership conferences, familiar territory. Then Daniel's tone shifted. What most people do not know is how this company was protected during its most vulnerable years. The room remained completely silent. Daniel glanced toward Margaret Ellis before continuing. 21 years ago, Walker Global Industries faced significant financial uncertainty. A series of restructuring decisions created the foundation for everything that followed. Those decisions were not made by executives seeking publicity. They were not made by individuals interested in recognition. They were made by someone who believed the company should outlive any single leader. I noticed several board members watching me now. Not casually, deliberately. The way people watch a person whose role in a story is finally becoming visible. Melissa noticed it too. Her breathing seemed shallower. Richard slowly turned his head toward me. The movement was almost mechanical. Daniel continued speaking. Over the years, ownership was secured through a long-term trust structure specifically designed to ensure stability, independence, and strategic continuity. Thomas Reynolds handed him another document. Daniel opened it carefully. That structure remains in place today. A nervous murmur spread through the ballroom. Employees looked at one another. Executives exchanged uncertain expressions. The phrase ownership structure carried weight. Real weight. People understood enough about business to recognize its importance. Daniel looked directly toward me again. The primary beneficiary of that structure has never changed. Melissa closed her eyes briefly. Richard's face lost. Even more color. Brandon looked as though he wanted someone to explain what was happening, but was afraid to ask. The room felt smaller now. Tighter. Every word seemed to pull another thread loose from the version of reality they had been living in. Daniel stepped away from the podium and spoke without looking at his notes. For more than 2 decades, this individual chose privacy over recognition. He declined public credit. He declined executive titles. He declined personal publicity. A few people began whispering. The whispers grew, then stopped again. Everyone sensed the reveal approaching. Daniel's voice remained calm. While others focused on visibility, he focused on protecting the company. While others built careers, he protected the foundation beneath those careers. Margaret Ellis stood and addressed the audience for the first time. As chair of the board, I would like the record to reflect our unanimous vote earlier this evening affirming both the existing ownership structure and the continued authority of its principal holder. That statement landed like a thunderclap without any noise. Employees looked confused. Executives looked alarmed. The board members looked completely serious. Melissa took a step backward. Richard gripped the edge of the table. Daniel finally spoke the words everyone had been waiting for. The majority owner of Walker Global Industries has been present in this ballroom all evening. The room exploded into whispers. Hundreds of voices. Hundreds of questions. Hundreds of assumptions collapsing at once. Daniel raised a hand, and the noise gradually faded. Then he looked directly at me. "Ethan," he said, "would you please join us on stage?" The reaction was immediate. Melissa's eyes widened. Richard looked as though the floor had shifted beneath him. Brandon simply stared. Around the ballroom, employees turned fully toward me. Some looked shocked. Others looked confused. A few executives suddenly seemed to understand exactly what was happening. I stood slowly from my chair. Water stains were still visible on my jacket. The same jacket they had laughed at less than an hour earlier. The same jacket still carrying traces of the humiliation they thought would define the evening. The room watched as I began walking toward the stage. One step, then another. Nobody laughed now. Nobody smiled. Because for the first time all night, they were finally seeing the person they had spent years refusing to notice. The walk to the stage felt longer than it actually was. The ballroom remained completely silent except for the sound of my shoes against the polished floor. Hundreds of eyes followed every step. A few executives lowered their heads as I passed. Others looked stunned. Some appeared to be replaying years of conversations in their minds, trying to understand how they had missed something this significant. I reached the stage and shook Daniel's hand. Then I nodded respectfully to Margaret Ellis and the rest of the board. The gesture seemed simple, but the reaction it triggered throughout the ballroom was immediate. People noticed familiarity. They noticed comfort. They noticed the absence of surprise. Daniel stepped aside and handed me the microphone. I looked across the room. Melissa stood frozen beside her table. Richard looked 20 years older than he had an hour earlier. Brandon stared at the stage with the expression of a man watching the collapse of everything he thought he understood. For several seconds, I said nothing. Silence has value when people are finally willing to listen. The giant company logo glowed behind me. The same logo employees saw every day. The same logo many people believed belonged to someone else. Finally, I spoke. "Good evening." My voice echoed through the ballroom speakers. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. "Most of you do not know me," I continued. And that was intentional. A ripple of uncertainty moved through the audience. I continued calmly. 21 years ago, when Walker Global Industries was struggling to survive, a decision was made to place ownership inside a protected structure designed to shield the company from short-term interests and outside pressure. That structure allowed leadership teams to focus on building the business instead of protecting it from constant interference. Several executives nodded slowly. They understood enough about corporate governance to recognize the significance of what I was describing. Thomas Reynolds stepped forward and opened one of the folders. Daniel displayed a document on the large screen behind me. Gasps spread through the room. Legal documents, ownership records, board certifications, trust agreements, names, dates, signatures, evidence, not rumors, not stories, evidence. "The trust established in 2005 remains active today," Margaret Ellis said, "and Mr. Ethan Carter remains its principal beneficiary and controlling owner." The reaction was immediate. Employees turned toward one another. Executives whispered. Managers looked visibly shocked. The percentage displayed on the screen appeared beside my name. 58% controlling ownership. Not a minor stake. Not symbolic influence. Control. Real control. Melissa covered her mouth. Richard sat down heavily in his chair. Brandon looked like he could not process what he was seeing. I watched them quietly. Years earlier, I had chosen privacy because I believed character mattered more than recognition. I never imagined that same privacy would eventually become the foundation of so much disrespect. Daniel returned to the podium. For 2 decades, Mr. Carter declined board positions, executive titles, media appearances, and compensation packages beyond what was necessary to maintain the trust structure. Another document appeared on the screen. Then another. The evidence continued. The room grew quieter with every page. Employees who had laughed earlier now looked uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Less than 2 hours earlier, people had watched me stand soaked in dirty water while my wife publicly treated me like an embarrassment. Now those same people were learning that every paycheck, every promotion, every office expansion, and every successful quarter existed beneath a structure I had spent years protecting. Melissa slowly walked closer to the stage. Her eyes never left me. "Ethan," she said softly. The microphone picked up her voice. The entire ballroom heard it. For the first time all evening, there was no arrogance. No superiority. No performance. Just disbelief. I looked at her, but did not answer immediately. She shook her head slightly. "Why did you never tell me?" The question hung in the air. Hundreds of people waited for my response. I considered it carefully. Then I answered with complete honesty. "Because I thought you loved the man, not the ownership documents." The silence that followed felt endless. Melissa looked down. Richard closed his eyes. Around the ballroom, people lowered their heads. Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. Nobody had anything left to say. Because in that moment, the truth was standing in front of them, and the truth was far more powerful than the story they had spent years believing. The ballroom remained silent long after my answer. It was the kind of silence that appears when people are forced to confront something uncomfortable about themselves. Daniel stepped away from the podium and allowed the moment to settle. No one rushed to speak. No one tried to explain. The truth had already done its work. I looked across the room at faces I had known for years. Employees, executives, managers, people who had walked past me countless times without a second glance. Most of them were not bad people. They had simply accepted the version of me that was easiest to believe. A quiet man attracts assumptions. A private man invites stories. And once enough people repeat those stories, they begin treating them as facts. Melissa slowly climbed the steps to the stage. Every movement seemed uncertain now. Earlier that evening, she had stood in front of hundreds of people completely convinced she understood exactly who I was. Now she looked like someone trying to recognize a stranger wearing a familiar face. "Ethan," she said quietly. "I never knew." I nodded once. "That is true." Tears formed in her eyes. Not dramatic tears. Not theatrical tears. Just the natural result of realizing that years of confidence had been built on a misunderstanding. "Can we talk?" she asked. I looked at her for several seconds before answering. "We have had 15 years to talk." The words were not cruel. They were simply honest. Sometimes honesty hurts more because it carries no anger. Richard approached the stage next. The proud executive who had spent years reminding everyone of his importance suddenly looked tired. Older. Smaller. He removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "I owe you an apology," he said. The entire ballroom listened. "No," I replied calmly. "You owe yourself an explanation." He frowned slightly. I continued. "You spent years judging people by titles, offices, and appearances. Eventually, you stopped seeing people altogether." Richard lowered his head. He did not argue because he knew I was right. Brandon never came to the stage. He remained at the table staring at the floor. For once, he had nothing clever to say, nothing sarcastic, nothing dismissive. Some lessons arrived quietly. Daniel returned to the microphone. "There is one final matter to address this evening." The room immediately focused on him again. Thomas Reynolds handed him another document. Daniel opened it and spoke carefully. "Following a review completed earlier this week, ownership has approved a leadership restructuring plan designed to strengthen accountability standards throughout the organization." Several executives shifted nervously. Daniel continued. "The review identified a number of managerial concerns involving workplace conduct, professional ethics, and abuse of authority." The room became still once more. Nobody knew exactly where the announcement was headed. Daniel glanced toward me before continuing. "Effective immediately, Richard Walker will retire from his current management role and transition into an advisory position pending further review. Brandon Walker's employment status will also be reviewed under standard corporate procedures." There was no cheering, no celebration, just consequences. Professional consequences. The kind that arrive when actions finally meet accountability. Melissa looked devastated. Yet the announcement was not about punishment. It was about responsibility. There is a difference. I stepped back toward the microphone one final time. Hundreds of employees watched. Some looked embarrassed. Some looked inspired. Others simply looked thoughtful. "I did not come here tonight expecting any of this," I said. "I came here hoping to support my wife at an important company event." The words hung in the air. Melissa closed her eyes. "Success is valuable," I continued. "Titles are valuable. Achievement matters. But if those things cause you to forget how to treat people, then they stop being strengths and become weaknesses." Nobody interrupted. Nobody disagreed. Character is easiest to measure when there is nothing obvious to gain. The ballroom remained completely silent. I handed the microphone back to Daniel and stepped away. A few moments later, I walked toward the exit. The same exit I had entered earlier that evening. My jacket still carried faint stains from the dirty water. I never bothered changing it. The doors opened. Cool Texas night, air drifted inside. Behind me stood hundreds of people, a board of directors, a leadership team, and a family forced to confront the consequences of their choices. Ahead of me was something much simpler. Peace. I stepped into the night without looking back. For the first time in many years, I was no longer carrying the weight of being misunderstood. And that felt worth far more than ownership, titles, or applause ever could.